Being a ministry wife is a vocation without a job description. And let's be honest, sometimes it seems like ministry might be easier if we did have one. If you are a ministry wife like me and are looking for hope, perspective, and a little bit of practical advice regarding your role, you're in the right place. Hi, I'm Christine Hoover, and welcome to the Ministry Wives Podcast, a production of the North American Mission Board. Join me as we hear from women from various ministry contexts, having authentic conversations about our shared joys and challenges, even the ones we're unsure we can talk about. No topic is off limits. Today, my guest on Ministry Wives is Jen Wilkin. You may know Jen as a Bible teacher and the author of several books, including None Like Him and 10 Words to Live By, and of course, some phenomenal Bible studies that take students through books of the Bible. But Jen also serves as the executive director of Next Gen Ministries and Resources at the Village Church in Flower Mound, Texas. In this episode, we talk about women in the church who have the gift of leadership. She shares her origin story, how she got where she is today, and she shares what her greatest challenges are in leadership and what she wants the church to know about men and women serving together within the local church context. This episode is actually a throwback episode from my previous podcast, By Faith. I wanted to share this interview with you today because it was one of my favorites in a year-long series I did previously on vocational ministry. And it also serves as an opportunity for me to tell you that if you're resonating with what we're doing here on Ministry Wives, there are seasons and seasons of episodes available in this very feed that you are welcome and invited to explore. With that, friends, here is my interview with the wonderful Jen Wilkin. It is my privilege to welcome Jen Wilkin. Hey, Jen.
Hey, how are you, Christine?
I'm good. I'm so excited to see you and get to chat with you today. We're going to chat about some pretty easy stuff. Leadership, women in leadership. Here we go.
Okay.
I know most people who are listening know you, but I'd love for you to introduce yourself and your family, where you're serving.
Okay, sure. I am married to Jeff for 29 years almost, and we have 4 children who were born to us, and then a 5th child who we got when she was a senior in high school. And she is great. And all of our kids are between the ages of 25 and 21. So the youngest is finishing up his senior year of college. We're about to be college free, and we are expecting a grandchild in the near future. So yeah, so life stages rushing upon us one after another. And I serve at my local church, the Village Church. I am responsible for Next Gen Ministries, for family ministry, and also for the Village Church Resources. And I also teach the women's Bible study, oversee the curriculum writing team, and that's always probably going to be my favorite thing.
Yes, I saw y'all are doing Romans this fall.
We are. Yeah, we are. And I was like, what could be hard about that? Oh, yeah, pretty much everything.
I know. Let's just dive into the hearts.
Good.
Yeah. Are y'all doing Romans all in the fall, or will you divide it into 2?
It's two semesters. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I know everyone listening is going to say, well, how do I get that curriculum? Because y'all aren't doing it online this year.
No, we're not putting them out in real time as we did during COVID. We did that as just, a way to help churches get resources in a time that was really difficult to do so. But we will make them all available once we have a chance to complete them here. Actually, people should be happy that we're not giving them the first iteration because there's always typos and weirdness. And so we'll work out all the kinks for you and then make them available as soon as they're ready from the editing process.
I'm so glad because I actually used y'all's. I went through during COVID year, Proverbs, Psalms. I loved it. And I loved that y'all did that, put stuff out. Y'all are cranking out really good curriculum over there, and you're in charge of all of that. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad it was helpful.
You didn't even mention that you write books, that you speak. I mean, again, people probably know that, but you're doing a ton of stuff. And I think sometimes when we see somebody in the spot they're in, at least for me, I always wonder, how did that person get to where they are? Because, you didn't just suddenly pop up at this stage in your life in the spots that you're in. You've been serving faithfully for a long time. So I would love to hear
kind of your, origination story? Like how did you get to where you are?
Yeah, I know that it would probably be reassuring to people to hear that I plotted out a life plan and then executed it flawlessly, but that has not been my story. I started serving in my local church after my first child was born, so I've been in some form of local church, fairly public ministry now for almost 25 years. And I was just looking for a way to plug in and meet people. And I was learning that I had a teaching gift. You and I were talking earlier about our time at Texas A&M, and my first job that I absolutely loved was being a tour guide at Texas A&M.
You were? Oh my gosh.
Yes, I was an evangelist for Texas A&M before I ever, but it took me a while to realize, oh, there's something bigger there, than just, in the sense of like, oh, I loved the school and I loved the message of it. But what if there was an even better message that I loved that I could devote my life to sharing with people, And so that wasn't all clear to me until I started to get into the local church and find opportunities to teach, or they kind of found me because I was a terrible small group member in my Bible study. I was talking too much. And I think that one of the leaders recognized, that was probably a sign that there was a teaching gift there. Thank the Lord, because she could have just said, "You're annoying, go home." And I started to have some opportunities. But everything that I was doing, was volunteer until I wrote a letter to our church saying, "Hey, you're cycling through women's ministry leaders because it's an unpaid position and this is a big church and they don't have, a volunteer doesn't have the amount of time to give to this, and it's not sustainable. You're not building any economies of scale because it's always a new leader." And so they received my letter and asked me to come in and meet with them. And then they offered me a job. I was stunned. My kids were 5, 4, 3, and 1 at that point. So I was unemployable on so many measures. And yet they said, "We want to make this work however we can for you." And I look back at that now and I think, so that would have been, around 2002. And I think I'm so grateful to that executive pastor who said, "This is a life stage that does make this hard, but we want to find a way to make it work because we see that you have a value that you can add to the organization." A lot of churches are just now starting to ask those questions about getting women plugged into the org chart. So that's kind of where it started. And then we ended up moving up to Dallas to be closer to family in 2007, after I had served as the women's ministry director at that church in Houston for 5 years in a part-time capacity, and got to the Village. And the Village did not have women's ministry. In fact, they did not want to have women's ministry. And I remember, and I didn't know anything about the Village when we got here. We didn't know who Matt Chandler was or anything like that. We were just looking for a church in our community. And someone had said, "Hey, you should try this one out." So there wasn't really anywhere for me to have a job at my local church, but I had done volunteer stuff before. So I started teaching in my home, and that kind of exploded on me. And eventually I ended up teaching at the Village for a couple of years, after which they made a dramatic shift in their ministry model. If you're familiar with the Simple Church model, and they did away with everything that wasn't weekend services or home groups. So we were basically shut down.
Off. Yeah.
We were cut off. And I have heard this story from so many women leaders. And so I hear you, I see you, I feel your pain if you're listening to this right now.
So take me to that moment, because you were leading that, your Bible study was large.
Yeah.
So
it was large. I was leading the largest ministry other than Sunday services, and I was a lay leader.
You were doing it all volunteer.
So it was all volunteer. Yeah. It was all volunteer. It was, and it was a rather quick announcement. And honestly, and for listeners, if you're thinking I'm telling tales on my church, this is a story that I tell with Matt and Josh publicly. Like, we now are able to look back and, we can hug each other and laugh and all of that. But it was tough. It was tough. So I went to them after they had told me that it was going away. And I said, I need to know that I can go do what the Lord has for me to do without it being seen as like me being disrespectful or, trying to make a big point. I said, you guys have the right to make this decision. We disagree philosophically on how discipleship happens. And that's, it is what it is. And they were like, no, we love what you do and you should go do it. And so I built it in the community, and we did basically a parachurch Bible study for 5 years.
Can we stop and just talk about that? Because I think a lot of women can relate to that. Either they've never had a way in to the church, or they feel like in order to use their gifts, they have to go outside of the church and maybe not even have the support of them saying, we love what you do, go do it. But the frustration of that, we have so many women who are like, I want to serve, I want to lead, I want to get these things going and be a part of what the church is doing. What would you say to them based upon that experience?
Oh, I mean, my heart is always first and foremost for the local church. That was the hardest part of it for me, was saying, yeah, I can do this anywhere, but the place I want to do it is among the people that I'm in fellowship with, And the weird result of that time period is that I ended up with, Jen in the Big C church instead of Jen in the Little C church, because there was no Jen in the Little C church. And I never really wanted or sought Jen in the Big C church. It just sort of happened, which was disorienting because we were podcasting the teaching so that the women could find them. And then all of these other women found them. So it was super weird. But I think to the woman who is feeling these things, know that it is God honoring that you see the local church and want to serve there. And you should continue to pray. If there are not currently doors open, you should continue to pray that the Lord would make a way. And you should continue to put yourself out there as you're able to. And I know how hard that is. It is hard. And to be met again and again with just no entry point is very difficult. But there is good and meaningful and satisfying work to be done in other spaces if that door is closed, and the Lord sees that as well, and he honors it. So all we can do is be faithful where the Lord has placed us. And I think this is a thing that is often lost on people in church leadership. The idea is, well, if you don't have a place to serve in your local church, just go join another church, right, where you can serve. But everybody knows it's not that easy. I mean, like in my case, my kids were all plugged in and serving. My husband was plugged in and serving. I was the only one who didn't fit in our local church during that season of life. And you know what you don't do when your kids are plugged in and thriving? You don't change churches, right? And so we have often a greater capacity for longevity in a local church, even if we're not able to serve in the way that we might hope or believe that we're intended to. But it can be hard. I mean, like I've always said, my marriage to Jeff has been very easy. The marriage that I have had a hard time with is the one to the local church. That has been a difficult relationship for me. But at least in I'm not saying that you shouldn't change churches. I think it's a question we have to ask. Otherwise, we might even get into like a weird codependent relationship with the church we're at. But there are sometimes good reasons for staying. And in my case, the staying ended up being something that the Lord used.
So what happened from there? How long, give us kind of go back to the timeline. You were doing that, what you called parachurch teaching. Then what happened that the village kind of came back around and changed things?
Well, when the Bible study was canceled, Jeff came to me and he said, hey, I know that you love what you're doing. And he has always been so supportive, and he was supportive even in this moment, but he was like, we've got kids heading toward college and I need you to bring in at least some kind of income, which is fair. My kids were all in school, and I had literally been creating Bible studies and teaching them for nothing. I wasn't, and that was fine. It wasn't like that. He's like, you got to find a job. So I called up the person I knew at the village and said, is there anything part-time hourly I can do that'll keep my brain free for, the writing and teaching that I'm doing, but also, I can earn a little income. And they hired me onto the communications team at $12.50 an hour in a project management role. And I remember going to Target on my lunch break and seeing a shirt and thinking, that is 2 hours of my work. I am not buying that. I mean, it was just, but it was great. It was lovely to have the role. But what that ended up doing inadvertently was it kept me sort of in the loop and in front of people. And that was not my intent. It's just how it worked out. And so I was in that part-time role I had been in it, I think, for 4 years. And I was just about to quit because the parachurch version of me was taking so much time that it was like, okay, I got to bite the bullet. I got to form a nonprofit and figure out a way, or whatever, a 401c3, and figure out a way for this to generate income, because it was generating no income. We had not even tried to make it do that. So I was about to quit. And then I see a video of JT English, who the church had just hired. He was talking about the importance of Bible literacy in the local church. And I was like, I had two simultaneous thoughts. One was, are you kidding me? A 29-year-old dude, that's who you can hear this from. And the other was just hope. I mean, just like, could the Lord do this for my church? Just what a gift it would be. And that really was the dominant feeling I had. JT eventually came and found me in the comm suite and said, hey, what are you doing over here? And I was like, I'm doing my job. And he said, well, why don't you come work for me? And we figured out a way to get the Bible study back. We were meeting across the street at the Methodist Church.
No way. Seriously?
Yeah, 850 women, most of them village church women. So we were able to move it back into the local church. We've built out the Bible study now for men and women, which is just one of the most beautiful things that has happened in all of this. And rolled back into the village. And I got to serve I finally got to serve in the local church.
That's amazing. So JT was the one who kind of pulled you in and were like, what are you doing?
Well,
let's do this.
Well, and basically, what had happened, the life cycle of the simple church model is pretty rough, because you hit a point where you realize, oh gosh, home groups can't do all the things we need them to do. And we put all of our eggs in one basket. And thankfully, the village got there pretty quickly. And so they were ready to correct the problem. And there I was, ready with a solution right across the road.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad. Well, did you ever have any conversations? I mean, I'm a fly on the wall. I'd love to be a fly on the wall with Matt, Chandler, and Josh, when they realize, oh, we've kind of put you out to pasture for a while. And now, what a blessing you are to our church. Have they come back around?
Oh, yeah. I think the way that they see it, and this is not, we see it a little differently, but I think the way they see it looking back, and this is valid, is, hey, our church was exploding numbers wise. And we didn't, we were trying to come up with something that was scalable and simple to address the discipleship concerns that we had. And they would say that clearing off all of the random things that were happening in pockets actually positioned them to then add back in the things that they wanted to strategically. And I think that's fair.
Yeah.
From my vantage point, I'm like, well, I wish you could have cleared off everything but the thing that was actually functioning and healthy, but I get it. And I never want to dismiss the enormous pressure they were under at that particular stage. You got to think about, during that season, well, right before we started women's Bible study was when Matt had a seizure. So he, at that point, he's going through chemotherapy. I mean, it was a time. I mean, there was so much happening around here that I don't look back and go, why were they such morons? I really look back on it and say they were doing what they knew to do in the moment.
Yeah.
And I had clarity on one piece of the puzzle, but they had to look at all of the pieces of the puzzle. Right. And so, they made a different decision than I would have made. But we all feel thankful that we stuck it out.
And we really think the larger C church is thankful to you, because y'all been an example to other churches. And we're going to talk some about women in leadership. But I think about those years. I don't know how long the years were where you were teaching at the Methodist church across the street. But to me, it would be easy to get better in those years, but also to wonder if this is wasted time. And obviously it's not wasted because you're ministering to women, but you still have this passion to be in the local church. And so I'm wondering what you learned in those years about dead ends or wasted years. What has God taught you through that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've had 2 seasons where I really had to ask that. One was when the kids were really little, and I I was like, oh, I can't even get to a Bible study,
Right.
much less think about writing one and, put two thoughts together. And I remember wondering if those years were just treading water. But I was reading and thinking, that I was absorbing a lot of things that were going to coalesce later into things that I really cared about and wanted to teach. And then in the case of the wandering, we call them the wilderness years, all the women who were with me, who started at the village, and then we went wandering in the wilderness, because we met in a living room, in two different living rooms. Women opened their homes that had large spaces. And so we started with, I crammed like 65 women into these. They were dangling off the stairs. I mean, it was something else.
That's awesome.
For a semester, we did that. And then we met at an Episcopalian church that had a potbelly pig for a pet. The stories we have about being out there and it was the sweetest church, but you'd be like, ladies, take a ride at the Potbelly Pig to find your small group room. And they had a crypt. They asked us if we wanted to have a small group in the crypt. And we were like, oh gosh, I just don't think Baptist women are going to understand that. And then we were 5 years at the Methodist church. And it always felt purposeful, because I actually had a lot of hot takes about parachurch ministries until I was thrown on my own resources and became one. And it renewed for me a sense of what they can do, that the local church can't necessarily. I'm a huge advocate that churches of a certain size should be providing discipleship environments for their own people. But the reality is there are a lot of small churches that don't have resources to offer the kinds of things that we were doing through Flower Mound Women's Bible Study, or that BSF does, or that CBS does. The trick is when you're at a big enough church that can do those things, and it has said, you know what, we'll just let a parachurch church handle that. So I learned a lot of lessons about what parachurch can and can't do. And I learned what I had suspected, that I think a lot of women lead parachurch organizations precisely because the barriers to entry are so difficult in the local church. And I don't think those women gave up easily before they started parachurch.
Yeah.
And then, I think it was all still a usable learning curve for when we moved back into the local church. And one of the hardest parts was that I had autonomy. When I was at the Methodist church, we did things exactly how we wanted to. And when you move back into the local church, it's an act of trust. Because you are going to be in submission to a calendar that is filled with a lot of things, and you're going to be responsible for someone else's money. And, it was all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But worth fighting through.
Yes. I'm wondering, now that you're in the spot, and I know your role has changed a little since that time, even when you came back under the church, but what from that point on, have been some obstacles you faced or discouragements you faced in leadership and I'm specifically thinking, I know we're putting the woman on it, but just a leader in your own right, leadership, what have you faced? What have you learned?
Well, the woman thing did have a lot to do with it, not because I always like to point out that there are no villains in my story. There was no one who was like, you know what, we hate women and we don't want women to be in certain spaces. No one was like that. And now I'm not saying that those people don't exist, but they didn't exist at my church. And I would say they didn't exist at my last church. But I will say that because our leadership structures have been typically all male or almost entirely male, that many of the systems that are in place just make it hard for women to be able to function as peers in those spaces. And I just like to clarify before we talk about women in leadership that I am at a complementarian church. We believe that the role of pastor elder is reserved for qualified men, and we specify what those qualifications are. There's a real actual process for determining what that is. We do not believe that all women submit to all men. We believe that men and women submit to elders in the church. Those are designations that took us a while to get to. I wouldn't say that we necessarily wouldn't have been there philosophically at an earlier point, but our practice did not demonstrate that at the village. And we had to encounter heartbreak before we could come to terms with it. So at the time that I'm being hired by JT, we had a very public care case that went south. And And because I had visibly moved from leadership in the local church to leadership in parachurch, a lot of the tender stories of women had found their way to me, because I think women thought, oh, she's had a hard season here. She'll be able to hear my hard thing. And it's nothing that would surprise anyone now. It was stories of women who were, maybe they were in an abusive marriage, but they didn't feel like they could speak up about it in a meeting that they had with church leadership because it was all men. Or, I mean, they're honestly looking back and realizing that this is a typical scenario people can recognize now is heartening to me, because at the time it was just being missed in many, many churches. And so while it was a hard providence that we had this public failure happen where we mishandled a care case, it was the Lord's kindness to us, because we started moving on fixing this problem. Honestly, before anybody had heard the phrase "Me Too," and we because it was devastating to our leadership that this had happened in our church. And so I was able to have a voice into that, I and some other women. And we became trusted allies through that. But for me, it was critical that I could not be the most visible female at our church next to Lauren Chandler if we were a church that was going to mishandle these things. It was going to harm women unintentionally. Yes. Yeah. And so we took 2.5 years to write a paper on women in ministry. It was an arduous process. It's the hardest thing I've ever had to be a part of, ever. I did not want to do it. I seriously thought, if we get in the weeds on this, I am going to find out that God actually loves men more than he loves women. Like I really thought, what if that's the outcome of this? That's how, I guess beat up I was at that point by some of these things. Of course, that is not what the outcome was, but to even talk about this as a woman in the church makes you a target.
Yes. And you have taken many bullets for women like me and women who are listening. And you've kind of become the poster child for this. And I know talking to you before that you really do not, you love biblical literacy and you want to teach the word, but you have become the woman who speaks up about this, which I appreciate, but I know that puts you in a certain spot. Before I will get to a question about that, I do want to say that the Village Church paper and the Knowing Faith podcast episode called A Generous Complementarianism, I would encourage everyone to go and read. It's been helpful for me and for our church. So thank you for all the work that you put into that. But you keep getting handed the microphone on this topic. And so which I'm thankful for, because you've done the work and you're doing it in practice. And so what do you want? Like, what is the thing that rises to the surface that you always want to say when people ask you about women serving in leadership roles within the church?
Oh gosh. So many things come to mind. There was a moment where I had been placed in the executive room. I was not yet in an executive leader role, but we were in the process where we were like, you know what, until we figure out the role piece, let's get female voices in that space. And so it was me and another woman who I love dearly. And it was hard. It was just hard. And obviously they wanted us, and they wanted not just women in the room, they wanted people in the room who were able to weigh in, across any decision we were making, but also a female perspective when it was helpful. And it just felt so clunky after all of those years of it being an all male space. And I grew up with 4 brothers, and I get it. I know how honestly fun the Band of Brothers thing is, the whole, it's and they could go on campouts together. They could, they had years of hunting trips and fun memories together. And now there's these 2 women in the room, and it's just different. So I was really feeling aware of the loss of camaraderie that was occurring as a result of putting us in the room. And even though I knew it was right, I still said, and I was having a conversation with JT, and I said, I feel bad, that I can feel how it's just not what it was before, and I'm sorry. And he said, hey, we didn't put you in the room because we think it's good for you to be in the room. We put you in the room because we think it's the best thing for the room. And we actually don't think that what we've lost is what we're focusing on. It's what we're getting to. It will be better. There will be a better form of community in this room than there was when it was all male, because this is what the Lord envisions, that it is not good for the man to be alone. And it was but we just weren't there yet, we hadn't hit that space. And I felt I was I'm still learning, I'm just a learner, because it's hard. I couldn't even see that brothers and sisters working shoulder to shoulder, even though I knew it was the more beautiful vision, it didn't feel like it initially. It does now. Mm-hmm. It does now. It feels unconscious, which is really, really sweet to see.
Yeah. So you would say to other churches who are considering this, thinking about these things, what would you say as they get started?
I would say it's very important if this is something that raises its head as critical to healthy ministry, and I hope that it would, that you'll have to push through the initial misgivings and growing pains. You'll have to be prepared to deal with criticism. People will say that you have a feminist agenda, or that you're progressive, or you're sliding liberal. And you'll have to have a deep conviction around it. I would say one of the most helpful things that came from sort of the playbook that I could point back to now and how we did things was, we wrote those papers, but we didn't announce them with trumpets and fanfare. We quietly set them to the side and began to implement, because by the time people wanted to critique what we were doing, we wanted to be able to point to the beauty of the practice. And so that has actually been, I think, helpful, because people will say this will never work. And we can say, but it is. Mm-hmm. I'm not preaching on Sundays at the Village, and I never will be. I don't even want that, contrary to what everybody would say in SBC, who thinks that there's this great undertow of women preachers just waiting to storm the pulpit. I'm that is so dumb, guys. I know women, if a woman wants to be a pastor, all she has to do is go across the street to the Methodist church.
That's right.
You're not. Anyway, that's a whole rant we don't need to get into now.
Well, that's what I'm like, where are these people that you're so worried about? What?
I know.
Where are they?
I'm if they were serious about that, they've already left, and so but the idea that there would be women with leadership gifts who are capable of contributing within the organization and not stepping into the role of pastor elder, if that category of woman exists, that's a whole different set of math that people have to do. And so the easier thing to do is say that category of woman doesn't exist and shouldn't exist. And so I do think that is the philosophical piece that churches have to wrestle through is, do we believe that God gifts women for leadership? Or do we believe, as the old school complementarians would say, that leadership is masculine and submission is feminine?
We've been talking about you as leader. Do you think that you are gifted in leadership, or would you say, you already said you had a gift of teaching, but do you have a gift of leadership?
I do. And I think we had an interesting conversation recently. There were a group of us talking about leadership, and the guys were talking about how imposter syndrome is a problem, where it's assumed immediately that if you can do one thing, you can do all things. Someone like Matt, if he has a preaching gift, he's also, he gets put in charge of organizations and all this kind of thing. I'm not saying that Matt is I think Matt's capable of doing the things he's in charge of, but when I show up with a teaching gift, people don't go, hey, let's examine if there are other things that she can do. That's all I can do. And so I was saying to them, we actually get imposter syndrome that heads the other direction. It's, well, she can't possibly have another aptitude besides just this teaching thing. We're, I think, perpetually underestimated, whereas male leaders are perpetually overestimated. And neither of those is a healthy scenario. It's just a different set of challenges to deal with. And so in my case, I was trusted and recognized as a teacher, but then, that was like, but can she lead? But can she lead? And I had to say, guys, do you realize I've been leading? Like, I've built this organization. I built it at my last church. I built it at your church. Then I built it in the community. And now I'm building it again in your church. And it's all volunteer run. So yeah, I can lead stuff, and so they got there, and they were invested in the conversation, because this is really important when you start placing women in the room, trying to get them at a peer level in the organization. You want that woman to be able to succeed. You don't want to put someone in there as a token, because then the grand experiment falls on its face and people say, see, I told you women weren't cut out to lead. Now, I think there is a backlog of female leaders who are waiting for an opportunity to lead. So I'm not saying it should be hard to find her, but I do think that the instincts of men in leadership don't always know who that woman is, because they don't know us. Yeah. Right. They know who the men are they can ping. And so their first instinct is typically to go to the wife of the man who they trust, instead of actually saying, who is a female leader in the church? Now, it may very well be the wife of a man they trust, but I find that it is not usually.
Yeah. So what is your greatest challenge in leadership in this church context you're in now?
Currently? Oh gosh. I think the greatest challenge for me is wanting to do this local church work well. It feels so important to follow through on this huge opportunity to model something, but also to actually do the work. And, but at the same time, I have a lot of other things pulling on me. I've got people want me to write more studies, and there's me in the church, and then there's me out there. And those two things are always sort of, fighting for time. And then also, as I mentioned, my family, we're super close and we want to hang out with each other. And I'm going to prioritize that. So I think finding out how to do this beautiful thing in the local church that I love and can't believe happened because I'm faithless, but also honoring the other things that I'm very committed to.
Do you feel pressure to get it right because so many people are looking at you?
I actually think the work itself is not complicated. It feels very clear to me what needs to happen. It's mainly just the time piece. So I feel like I have I don't lack for vision around what I want to see happen. And I don't lack for vision around how to get there. And I have a great team that's working with me. And so and we have resources, we're a big church. And so those pieces feel easy. I think it's mainly just, I'm 52 years old. And part of me wishes that this had come my way 10 years ago.
Why is that? I don't know how long. Because you would have had kids at home still.
I know, but now I'm going to be an old woman by the time all of this finally starts to turn.
Oh my gosh. Well, you're actually bringing up a topic that I wanted to ask you about, because I am like little peon next to you, but I feel the tension of the local church. My husband's a pastor. I want to serve the women in my church. I want to serve my church, but then I'm writing and I'm, speaking and all of that. And I feel so much tension around that, of how a lot of times I feel like I have more opportunities outside the church, but my heart is in the church. And of course I want to do what God asked me to do, but I'm just wondering, how do you make decisions about that? How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah. Well, I think the decision-making looks a little different now than it has in earlier stages. I did go through a phase where I began to have a growing influence outside of the church, and it needed to be stewarded. Like, I needed to think hard about how much time I was going to give to travel and things like that. But now that feels stable. I feel like, okay, people can find me if they want to find what I'm doing. I don't need to think, sort of like carefully about how often I speak on one coast versus the other, knowing that I have limited time to give to it, those kinds of things. That feels less top of mind. But I think now that the challenge is that within the local church, so I've seen a lot of women doing ministry, outside the local church and the struggles that are unique to that. And I think that the most healthy relationship that I see for myself in all of this is that what I'm doing in the local church drives what I'm offering to the Big C church. That's always been the case, but recognizing the beauty of it is increasingly obvious to me that if you're doing a study that I put out through Lifeway, I've taught it 3 times in the local church, probably before you ever knew it existed. And that means it's a better study, by the time it goes out to the Big C church, because we know where all the kinks are. But also it means that it's an overflow act instead of a foundational act. And that is what I need. I need to know that by the time it gets out to the Big C church, it's been thought about a ton. And it wasn't something that I started from nothing and built. And I'm not dogging on people who their Big C church existence is something that starts from nothing and goes from there. I personally could not sustain it based on the other things that I'm wanting to do.
Yeah. Also, you've told me before that you have more of a challenger personality, which is that how you would describe it? Challenger?
Oh yeah. 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 And, I even had someone say to me, oh, well, the reason you're bringing this up is because you love conflict. And I was like, I don't love conflict. Like maybe 23-year-old me liked conflict. The 52-year-old me is like, I am picking my battles, but if I spoke up on it, it means, it's important to me. So I definitely have that personality. And, I think we all have probably taken enough personality tests at this point to know that if you're a female and you have that personality, there is a 1-syllable word that we apply to you to describe you. And if you are a female in the church, that idea is often even amplified more, because women in the church are supposed to demonstrate a quiet and gentle spirit by being actually quiet. And never saying anything that sounds ungentle in any way. That is a stereotype that can be difficult, but I have found that it is a good discipline for me to be slow to speak and to find a soft way to say a hard thing. Those are all very important and godly things for me to be trained in. So it's not making myself smaller. I know that's the fear that women think they're going to be told to make themselves smaller. I think it is, in many ways, it's bearing with others in their weakness because they can't handle the big me. But in other ways, it's making sure that I'm not sinning in the big me version of myself, and caring more about the message than being able to present it in whatever tone I want.
Can you give an example of that? Because I'm thinking women who are like that. They're listening and thinking, okay, how do I do that well? I want to be who I am, who God has made me to be, but I also want to do it in a really wise way. So take us maybe into a meeting where you need to speak up. How do you handle that?
So it depends, obviously, on who the players are in the meeting. And one of the things that has been really sweet about having served now on the executive team for, I think it might be 3 years now, is that we have a trust level with each other. And I am able to be an unfiltered version of myself in that space. But if you're in a room with someone who you don't have an established level of trust with, because the relational piece that we just talked about isn't fully built out, then you really should, just as a means of being respectful of the current state of the relationship, you really should choose with care when you're going to speak and what you're going to say. I'm quick to speak by nature, and not only that, but I am capable with my words. And so I can win an argument based on giving the clearest outline of it. But that doesn't mean that's the right way to go about it. So I, for many years, when I was not in a position of authority in a room, I would write a sticky note that said, "Don't talk." And I would put it on my notebook when I would walk into the room. And I never regretted reading the note. I didn't always adhere to the note. And there were times when I regretted that, but I never regretted waiting and letting a conversation play out. And many times, if you know that the person who you need to give a direct critique to, if you know that as a fragile person, don't do it in front of other people. Go have a meeting after the meeting where you say, "Hey, I've given some thought to this. And I want to ask you a couple of things, and then have a dialogue that doesn't expose them, at least in their minds, to the ridicule of others by having that conversation. So those are some of the things that I've done that I think have been helpful. But also, if you need to speak up on something and you haven't put the work into building relationship in advance of that, just know that you may be out of line to do so, that you might need to just go have coffee with someone and say, I want to get to know you. I want to know about your family and your kids, so that when you do have that meeting, they don't feel like you're someone trying to take something from them.
That's good advice. I've seen you do this before, but really well, where you waited in a conversation where there's some really heavy topics, and you waited. And I'll just tell you, in the room, I was like, I want Jen to speak up. I want to hear what Jen has to say. But you waited. You almost waited longer than it was like you were the person in the room who could put the period on the sentence, and everyone kind of knew it. But you waited. And then when you spoke, it was just perfect. So hearing you say even that you always spoke earlier than you wanted to when you were younger is surprising to me, because I see you as someone who waits and speaks at the right time. So,
well, sure, because I blew myself up on a bunch of landmines.
Well,
no, that's what I'm saying. I mean, if you really, and I think most of us, if we look back and take inventory of the times that our words have gotten us in trouble versus the times that our silence has gotten us in trouble. And again, this is heavily personality driven, because there are people who never speak up when they should, right? So if you're that girl, I'm not talking to you right now. For those of us who our tendency is to win with words, silence is an underutilized tool. And I always think of that proverb, even a fool is considered wise when he holds his tongue. And I'm thinking, gosh, that's me. I need to just sit there. Maybe if I say nothing because I have nothing to say, they'll at least think I was being self-controlled, but well, no, I would love to tell you, I learned these lessons the easy way by reading the scriptures and adhering to them. But like most sin patterns, I learned them the hard way.
I really respect you a lot. I love what you're doing. I have learned from you. I've done your Bible studies, read your books, but yeah, I just really am thankful for you. And I want to encourage you. And I know everyone listening is like, please keep going, Jen. We need you in the church. We need you leading the way, because you really have done such an excellent job with where God has put you. And so that leads to my final question. I've wondered, who do you look up to? Who's an example for you as you do what you're doing?
Oh gosh. I mean, in ministry specifically, I would have to say that I look up to my mentor, Pat Connor, who she's also my friend. She probably doesn't like that I always call her my mentor. She's my friendtor. She has been a woman in ministry for years and years and years. And she led at, the high level in the church that she was in for a very long time. And she helped me learn when to speak. She would coach me on a lot of this, but also in just her life and her example, the way that she's been a mother and a grandmother and a wife. She's just a person who I always think I want to be more like her, because she looks like Christ. So she's had a huge influence on me. In the public sphere, I know that it is, people lose their minds when you say this, which is ridiculous, by the way, but Beth Moore has been a person who persevered, and she talked about someone who has held their tongue. And it's kind of fun to see later in life, Beth Moore, where she's now more free to speak than she perhaps was in the first 20 or 30 years. And so, no, do Beth and I always teach and think the same things, from a theological standpoint? No, I could say that about a lot of people. And I respect her as a woman who has spoken up when it mattered most. She spoke up on the abuse issue. And who has modeled steadfastness as a woman in the public sphere in ministry. I cannot even imagine the stories. I'm like, I hope she writes a memoir, but I also am not sure if the world can handle it, and I don't know that many people know this, but she reaches out to other female leaders who are coming along behind her and offers help, just, hey, if there are questions about doing public ministry that you need help with, please, I want to help you with that. And that is invaluable.
Yeah.
And so kind. This is a woman who has plenty to do, so.
Yeah. Oh yeah. She's leaving
great.
a legacy. That's for sure. Well, thank you for joining me today, Jen. I just love hearing your insights, and I know it's going to be so helpful for people listening. So thank you for your time.
I'd love to get to be on, Christine.
Thanks so much for listening to the Ministry Wives podcast, a production of the North American Mission Board. If you found this content helpful, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your podcast platform or share it with a friend. You can find this podcast and other helpful resources at ministrywivespodcast.com.
I'm Trevin Wax, and I have a new podcast called Reconstructing Faith. In it, we address the church's credibility crisis, reflecting on the challenges of today while learning from church history and the church around the world. Look for it wherever you get your podcasts.